There is a castle on an island shaped like a heart. 6 stories high, 120 rooms, towers and turrets reaching toward the sky. Italian gardens, a powerhouse, a yacht house on a neighboring shore. It was never lived in. Construction stopped in the middle of the night. Workers were told to leave. Tools were abandoned where they fell. Doors were left unlocked. For 73 years, no one came back. The castle stands in the Thousand Islands, where the St. Lawrence River forms the border between the United States and Canada. The water here is cold and clear. Islands dot the surface for miles, some large enough for estates, others barely room for a single tree. Hart Island is small, just 5 acres, but in 1900, it became the site of one of the most ambitious private construction projects in American history. And then, in 1904, it became a monument to sudden loss. This is not a story about ghosts or mysteries. This is a story about a man who built a palace for his wife and what happened when she died before it was finished. This is a story about ambition and grief, about immigrant dreams and impossible loss, about what remains when the person you built everything for is gone. George Charles Boldt was born in Prussia in 1851 in a small town on the Baltic coast. The town was called Rügenwalde. It sat near the cold waters of the Baltic Sea in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. It was a place of merchants and fishermen, of narrow streets and timber-framed houses. George's father worked as a clerk. The family was not wealthy. They were ordinary people in an ordinary town living ordinary lives. But George Boldt would not have an ordinary life. When he was 13 years old, he left Germany and sailed to America alone. He arrived in New York City with no money, no connections, no English. The year was 1864. The Civil War was still being fought. New York was crowded with immigrants, all of them arriving with the same desperate hope that America would give them what Europe could not. George's first job was in a hotel kitchen, washing dishes, cleaning floors, the kind of work that immigrants did when they had nothing else. He slept in a shared room with other workers. He ate whatever was left after the guests had been served. He worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week. But George Boldt was paying attention. He watched how the hotel operated. He learned how guests were treated. He understood that hospitality was not just about clean rooms and good food. It was about creating an atmosphere where people felt important. It was about anticipating needs before they were spoken. It was about creating an experience that made the wealthy feel that their wealth was justified. George studied English. He observed the manners of the upper class. He learned how they spoke, how they dressed, how they carried themselves. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was no longer washing dishes. He worked as a waiter, then as a maître d'. He learned the names of guests. He remembered their preferences. He made them feel seen. By the time he was 26, he was managing the dining room at the Philadelphia Club, one of the most exclusive private clubs in the country. The Philadelphia Club was where old money gathered. Bankers, industrialists, men whose families had been wealthy for generations. They came to the club to eat, to drink, to conduct business away from public scrutiny. George Boldt ran the dining room with precision. Every table was perfect. Every meal was flawless. Every guest was treated as if they were the most important person in the room. That's where he met Louise. She was the daughter of the club steward, 15 years old, dark hair, intelligent eyes. She helped her father manage the behind-the-scenes operations of the club. George was 27. He noticed her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, but because she understood the work the way he did. She saw the details. She knew that hospitality was more than efficiency. It was about creating an atmosphere where people felt cared for. They married 2 years later, on June 14, 1877. George was 28, Louise was 17. By all accounts, it was a true partnership. This was not a marriage where the wife stayed home while the husband worked. Louise was involved in every aspect of George's career. She helped him run his hotels. She trained staff. She chose decorations. She designed menus. She understood hospitality the way George did. She added touches that made guests feel welcomed. Fresh flowers in the rooms, candles on the tables, handwritten notes thanking guests for their patronage. Small details that turned a hotel into something more personal. Together, they built an empire. In 1881, George bought the Bellevue Hotel in Philadelphia. It was a risk. He borrowed money. He mortgaged everything he owned. The Bellevue was a mid-tier hotel, respectable but not exclusive. George intended to change that. He renovated. He raised the prices. He deliberately priced out anyone who couldn't afford luxury. It sounds cruel, perhaps, but George understood his market. He knew there were enough wealthy people in Philadelphia to fill a luxury hotel. He knew that exclusivity created demand. He wanted his hotels to be places where only the wealthiest Americans gathered, where business deals were made, where politicians met, where the elite felt at home. It worked. Then he bought the Stratford Hotel. He applied the same strategy: high prices, impeccable service, an atmosphere of refined elegance. By the early 1990s, George and Louise Boldt were wealthy, not millionaires yet, but successful. They had built something together. They had proven that an immigrant from Prussia and the daughter of a club steward could succeed in a world dominated by old money. In 1895, George Boldt received an offer that would change everything. William Waldorf-Astoria, one of the wealthiest men in America, had built a hotel in New York City, the Waldorf Hotel, 13 stories, 500 rooms. It was designed to be the most luxurious hotel in the world. But Astor needed someone to manage it, someone who understood luxury hospitality, someone who could make the Waldorf live up to its ambitions. He hired George Boldt. George and Louise moved to New York. They took over the Waldorf, and they transformed it. The Waldorf became more than a hotel. It became an institution. Presidents stayed there, actors, writers, industrialists. The wealthiest families in America made the Waldorf their New York home. George understood that managing a luxury hotel was more than just logistics. It was about creating an experience. Guests didn't just want clean rooms and good food. They wanted to feel special. They wanted to feel that the hotel existed for them. 4 years later, in 1897, John Jacob Astor IV built a hotel next to the Waldorf, the Astoria Hotel. Even larger, even more luxurious. The two buildings were connected, and George Boldt was put in charge of both, the Waldorf-Astoria. It became the most famous luxury hotel in the world. 17 stories, over 1,000 rooms, ballrooms, restaurants, a barber shop, a telegraph office. It was a city within a city. George became a millionaire. By the standards of the early 1900s, he was extraordinarily wealthy. He had achieved something almost impossible. A 13-year-old immigrant with no money and no connections had become one of the most successful hoteliers in America. And he wanted to give Louise something that matched everything she had given him. In 1895, the Boldts began spending summers in the Thousand Islands. It was a fashionable destination at the turn of the century. Wealthy families from New York and Philadelphia built summer homes on the islands. They sailed yachts. They hosted garden parties. They escaped the heat and noise of the cities. The Thousand Islands sit where the St. Lawrence River flows out of Lake Ontario, forming the border between the United States and Canada. The water is cold and clear.
The islands number in the thousands, some large enough for estates, others barely room for a single tree. It was a place of natural beauty. Pine trees growing down to the water's edge, rocky shores, clear summer skies. The Boldts stayed at the Wellesley House, a hotel near the estate where George had established farms and other properties. They enjoyed their summers there, but George wanted more. He wanted a home, not just a summer cottage, a real home, a place that was entirely theirs. In 1900, he purchased Hart Island, a small piece of land in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. The island was unremarkable, 5 acres of rock and trees, but George saw potential. He had the island reshaped, tons of earth were moved, the shoreline was recontoured, carved and sculpted until the island itself formed the shape of a heart. Then he renamed it Hart Island. It was an extravagant gesture, romantic in a way that seems almost impossible now. But George Boldt was a romantic. He had built an empire with Louise. Everything he had achieved with her. The island would be his gift to her, a monument to their partnership. The plans for the castle were ambitious beyond anything the region had seen.
George hired the architectural firm of G.W. and W.D. Hewitt, the same firm that would later design the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. They were among the most respected architects in America. The castle would be 6 stories tall, 120 rooms, 30 bathrooms, steel and concrete construction, cutting edge for the time. The building would be fireproof, a major concern in an era when fires regularly destroyed wooden structures. The exterior would be light granite, quarried 16 kilometers away on Oak Island. The stone would be cut and shaped by master masons. The design was inspired by Rhineland castles in Germany, George's homeland, but the overall aesthetic was that of a French chateau. Towers, turrets, balconies overlooking the water, steep roofs with ornate dormers. This was not a modest summer home. This was a palace. But the castle was only part of the plan. George commissioned a powerhouse on the eastern edge of the island, designed to generate electricity for the entire estate. In 1900, electrification was still new. Most homes used gas lamps or candles, but George wanted his castle to have electric lights, electric heating, all the modern conveniences. He wanted tunnels connecting the buildings underground so servants could move between the castle and the powerhouse without being seen. He wanted Italian gardens with fountains and sculptures, marble pathways, rose gardens, a pergola covered in climbing vines. He wanted a drawbridge, he wanted a dovecote, he wanted every detail to be perfect. On the south side of the island, he commissioned the Ulster Tower, a deliberately whimsical structure with slanted walls and uneven ceilings. It would serve as a playhouse for the Boldt children and as entertainment for guests. It even included a 2-lane bowling alley in the basement. The Ulster Tower was designed to look like a medieval defensive tower, but it was pure fantasy, a playful addition to an already extravagant estate. On nearby Wellesley Island, George built a massive yacht house to store his boats. The yacht house was enormous, large enough to house multiple vessels. It included living quarters for the staff who would maintain the boats. Every detail was planned, every expense was justified. This was not just a home, this was a statement, a monument to what George and Louise had built together. This was proof that an immigrant from Prussia could build something that rivaled the estates of families who had been wealthy for generations. Construction began in 1900. 300 workers were brought to the island: stonemasons, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, plasterers, artists who would paint murals on the ceilings, craftsmen who would carve wood panels for the walls. Many of them were immigrants like George, skilled craftsmen from Italy, Germany, Poland, men who had come to America looking for work and found it on a small island in the middle of a river. They worked year-round, despite the brutal winters. The winters in the Thousand Islands are harsh. The river freezes solid, snow piles up and drifts, temperatures drop well below zero.
But the work continued. The workers lived in temporary housing on the island. They heated their quarters with coal stoves. They wore heavy coats and gloves. They kept working, even when ice formed on the half-finished walls. The powerhouse was completed first. It was a beautiful building in its own right. Stone construction with large arched windows. Inside, massive generators would produce electricity for the entire estate. Then the Ulster Tower, the whimsical playhouse with its slanted walls and bowling alley. The yacht house on Wellesley Island was finished by 1903. It was added to ship registries as one of the largest private boathouses in America. The castle itself rose slowly. The granite walls went up floor by floor. The steel framework was installed. Windows were set into place. The interior spaces began to take shape. Rooms emerged from the stone. Hallways, staircases, ballrooms, bedrooms, bathrooms with modern plumbing. George visited the island often, inspecting the progress, making decisions about materials and design. He wanted everything to be perfect. He consulted with architects. He reviewed blueprints. He approved every detail. Louise came with him sometimes, walking through the unfinished rooms, imagining what they would become. She would stand in the empty spaces and describe how they would be decorated, the colors she would choose, the furniture she would order, the paintings she would hang on the walls. The castle was scheduled to be completed in 1904. George planned to give it to Louise as a Valentine's Day gift. He had it all planned. He would bring her to the island on February 14th. The castle would be finished, fully furnished, perfect in every detail.
He would present it to her as the culmination of everything they had built together, their palace, their paradise. But Louise never saw it finished. In the fall of 1903, Louise began to feel ill. At first, it seemed minor. She was tired, she felt weak, she complained of chest pains. Louise had always been healthy. She was only 42 years old. She was active, energetic, involved in every aspect of George's business. But now something was wrong. George brought in the best physicians in New York. They examined her, they ran tests, they consulted with specialists. The diagnosis was a heart condition. The doctors were not specific about the exact nature of the illness. Medical knowledge in 1903 was limited. They did not have the diagnostic tools that exist today. But they knew it was serious. They tried every treatment available at the time. Rest, medications, special diets. Nothing worked. Louise grew weaker. The chest pains grew worse. She struggled to breathe. George stayed with her constantly. He canceled meetings. He left the management of the Waldorf-Astoria to his staff. Nothing mattered except Louise. On January 7, 1904, Louise Boldt died in their home in Manhattan. George was with her when it happened. She was 42 years old. They had been married for 26 years. The next day, George sent a telegram to Hart Island. The message was short, 4 words: "Stop all construction." The workers put down their tools. They left the island that same day. 300 men gone overnight. The castle stood half-finished. The top floors were open to the sky. Interior walls were unpainted. Staircases led to rooms that didn't exist yet. Windows had no glass. Tools were left where they had been dropped. Scaffolding remained in place. Materials sat in piles waiting to be used. George Boldt never returned to Hart Island, not once. He lived for 12 more years after Louise died. He continued managing the Waldorf-Astoria. He remained active in business. He donated money to hospitals and libraries. He established scholarships at Cornell University. He attended social functions. He maintained friendships. He continued to work. But he never went back to the castle. Some would later wonder whether this was entirely about grief, or whether George, a practical businessman who understood costs and returns, recognized that an unfinished palace had become a burden without purpose.
The castle had been Louise's dream as much as his gift to her. Perhaps finishing it alone would have required him to make every choice she would have made, to select fabrics she would have chosen, to arrange furniture in rooms she would never walk through, to imagine her living in spaces she would never see. Maybe walking away was the only honest response. Maybe the unfinished castle was a more accurate monument than a completed one would have been. A monument to interrupted dreams, to love that ended too soon. The island fell silent. For 73 years, Boldt Castle sat abandoned. The winters were harsh in the Thousand Islands. Ice formed on the river every year, thick enough to walk on. Snow accumulated on the castle's unfinished roof, bearing down the exposed beams. Water seeped through the open floors, freezing and thawing, cracking the stonework. The freeze-thaw cycle is brutal on buildings. Water seeps into cracks, it freezes, it expands, the cracks widen, more water seeps in. The castle began to deteriorate. Vandals came by boat. In the early years, they were just curious. They wanted to see the abandoned castle. They walked through the empty rooms. They took souvenirs. But as the decades passed, the vandalism became more destructive. They broke windows that somehow survived the weather. They tore out copper pipes and sold them for scrap. They ripped out light fixtures. They spray-painted walls. They smashed decorative stonework. They destroyed what time and weather had not yet claimed. Local people told stories about the castle. Some said it was haunted. They claimed to see lights in the windows at night, even though there was no electricity. They said they saw a woman in white walking along the shore, looking out at the water. They said if you went to the island at night, you could hear music playing, phantom parties, echoes of celebrations that never happened. The stories were not true. The lights were flashlights carried by trespassers. The woman in white was imagination. The music was wind whistling through broken windows. But the stories persisted, the way ghost stories always do when a building stands empty for too long. The castle became a local legend, a cautionary tale, a reminder that wealth could not protect against loss. By the 1970s, Boldt Castle was a ruin. The roof had collapsed in several places. Rain poured into the upper floors. Trees grew inside some of the rooms, their roots pushing through the floors. Graffiti covered the walls. Broken glass littered the floors. It looked like a structure that would never be saved. It looked like something that would eventually have to be demolished. But in 1977, something changed. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority purchased Hart Island from the Boldt family for $1. $1 for an entire island, for a 6-story castle, for a powerhouse and a yacht house and Italian gardens. The agreement was simple. The Bridge Authority would restore the castle. All revenue from tours and events would go toward continuing restoration. The goal was not to finish what George Boldt had started. The goal was to preserve what remained. It was a massive undertaking. The damage was extensive. Entire sections of the castle had to be rebuilt. Windows had to be replaced. The roof had to be reconstructed. Walls had to be reinforced. The work required engineers, architects, historians, craftsmen who understood historical restoration. They studied photographs from the construction period. They examined the original blueprints. They tried to understand what George and Louise had intended.
The work took years. It continues today, even now, decades after the restoration began. But gradually, Boldt Castle was brought back from the edge of total collapse. The first floor was restored and furnished, decorated in the style Louise would have chosen: Victorian elegance, dark wood paneling, ornate furniture, heavy drapes. The second floor was open to visitors. Some rooms were furnished, others were left partially complete, showing the state of the castle when construction stopped. Exhibits were installed showing photographs of the castle during construction, during abandonment, during restoration.
Visitors could see what the castle had looked like in 1904, what it looked like in 1977, what it looks like now. The powerhouse was saved. The generators were removed, but the building itself was preserved. It now houses a small museum about the history of the island. The Ulster Tower was repaired. The slanted walls and uneven ceilings were stabilized. The bowling alley was restored. Visitors can walk through the playhouse and imagine the Boldt children running through the rooms. The yacht house on Wellesley Island was preserved and added to the National Register of Historic Places. The Italian gardens were replanted, fountains were restored, the marble pathways were repaired, rose gardens were cultivated. Slowly, Hart Island came back to life. Today, Boldt Castle is one of the most popular tourist destinations in the Thousand Islands region. Hundreds of thousands of people visit every year, arriving by private boat or on tour vessels that depart from Alexandria Bay. They walk through the rooms George Boldt designed for Louise. They climb the staircases. They stand on the balconies overlooking the river. They take photographs. Most visitors know the basic story. A man built a castle for his wife. She died before it was finished. He abandoned it out of grief. But the full story is more complicated than that. Some historians have questioned whether George stopped construction purely out of grief. They point out that the castle was primarily Louise's project. They suggest that George, a practical businessman, may have seen the unfinished castle as a financial burden after her death. Why continue pouring money into a building that would never serve its intended purpose? Others argue that George's reaction was exactly what it appeared to be, a man so heartbroken that he could not bear to finish something that was meant to be a gift, a monument to love that became a monument to loss. The truth is probably somewhere between those two interpretations. George Boldt was a businessman. He understood costs and returns. He knew how to make practical decisions. But he was also a man who had spent his entire adult life building something with Louise. Everything he had achieved with her. The hotels, the Waldorf-Astoria, the wealth, the success. When she died, the foundation of everything he had built collapsed. Finishing the castle would have required him to make decisions Louise would have made, to choose colors she would have chosen, to select fabrics and furniture and paintings, to furnish rooms she would have lived in, to imagine her presence in spaces she would never occupy. Maybe he couldn't do that. Maybe the thought of completing the castle without her was unbearable. Maybe it was easier to walk away and leave it unfinished, a permanent reminder of what was lost. George Boldt died on December 5, 1916, of a heart attack in Manhattan. He was 65 years old. He was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, next to Louise. Their children, George Jr. and Clover, inherited the Waldorf-Astoria and the other properties. They continued their father's business. They maintained the hotels. They preserved his legacy. But neither of them ever lived on Hart Island. Neither of them finished the castle. The island passed through the family for decades, generating no income, costing money in taxes and upkeep, slowly deteriorating. The family paid the taxes every year. They kept legal ownership, but they did nothing with it. Perhaps they understood that the castle was too personal to finish, that it belonged to George and Louise in a way that made it inappropriate for anyone else to complete. Finally, in 1977, the family sold it for $1, with the understanding that it would be preserved for the public. That decision saved Boldt Castle.
If you visit Hart Island today, you can see what George and Louise Boldt intended to build. The castle is not exactly as they planned it. The restoration efforts have focused on preserving what existed in 1904, not on completing the unfinished sections. Some rooms remain empty, their walls unpainted, their floors bare. But the structure is sound. The gardens are beautiful. The powerhouse has been converted into a small museum. The Ulster Tower is open for tours. You can stand in the grand entrance hall and imagine what it would have looked like if construction had continued. The marble floors, the sweeping staircase, the chandelier that was never installed. You can walk through the rooms on the first floor, furnished now in period style, and picture George and Louise living there, hosting dinner parties, entertaining guests, spending quiet evenings together. You can climb to the upper floors, where some spaces are still unfinished, and see exactly what the workers left behind in January 1904. The bare walls, the exposed beams, the places where plaster was never applied. And you can stand on the balcony overlooking the St. Lawrence River and understand what George Boldt was trying to create. A place removed from the world, a private paradise, a monument to everything he and Louise had built together. An island shaped like a heart in the middle of a river, where they could escape the demands of the Waldorf-Astoria and the noise of New York City and simply exist together. It's strange to walk through Boldt Castle knowing that no one ever lived there, that all this effort, all this expense, all this ambition was for nothing in the end. 300 workers spent 4 years building something that was never used. Millions of dollars were spent on a palace that never housed a single dinner party, a garden that Louise never walked through, a ballroom where she never danced. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. George Boldt built the castle as an expression of love. In that sense, he succeeded. The castle exists. People visit it. They learn the story. They're moved by it. They understand, perhaps more clearly than if the castle had been completed, what George and Louise meant to each other. Louise never lived there, but in a way, her presence is stronger because she didn't. The castle is frozen at the moment of her death. It represents a dream that was never realized, which makes it more powerful than if it had simply become another summer home. Finished buildings are ordinary. They become normal. They lose their meaning over time. Unfinished buildings, haunted by the reason they were abandoned, are something else. They remain vivid. They retain their emotional power. Boldt Castle is not a ruin anymore. It has been saved, restored, preserved. But it remains incomplete. And that incompleteness is what gives it meaning. It stands as a reminder that love does not always get the ending it deserves, that death interrupts plans, that some dreams are too big to survive the loss of the person who inspired them. George Boldt could have finished the castle after Louise died. He had the money, he had the workers, he had the plans. He could have turned it into a memorial, a museum, a monument with her name carved in stone above the entrance. But he didn't. He walked away. And in walking away, he left something more honest than any memorial could have been. A building frozen in time. A moment of grief made permanent in stone and steel. Hart Island is quiet now, except during tourist season. In the winter, when the river freezes and the boats stop running, the castle stands alone again, the way it did for 73 years. The towers rise above the ice. The windows reflect the gray winter sky. The gardens sleep under snow. And somewhere in the silence, the dream that George Boldt built for Louise remains. Unfinished, abandoned, but somehow still alive.